Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Rick Lowe, a Houston-based artist and community organizer whose project Row Houses is considered an important example of social practice art. In 2014, Lowe was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Lowe gave a talk, Art and the Social Context, at the U of O on May 2nd, 2016. The talk was sponsored by Design, Create, Change, the proposed new interdisciplinary major in the School of Architecture and Allied Arts. Thanks so much, Rick, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
First question is a simple one, or maybe not so simple. What is social practice art, in your opinion?
Oh my. Not, well, that term brings up a lot of different things. And for me, it's a little bit controversial because I fit within the rim of what people call social practice art, but I consider my work more social and community engaged art. And there's a little bit of difference there in that my work is really community based. It's generally, it connects to issues that are relevant and going on in specific communities. And I think the social practice side, sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be community based. It's much more work that just deals within the social rim. And so it's a new form of art that's been kind of shaping in the lineage of Western kind of thinking around art practice.
I know that you have used the term social sculpture. Tell us the origin of that term and tell us how you understand that.
I live in a complex world, right? I live between social practice, social and community engaged art, and social sculpture.
Okay.
And actually, to me, if I was drawn to the idea of social sculpture basically because it was my avenue to get into work that operated within the social and community sphere. And it comes from a German artist by the name of Joseph Beuys. There was a book, he had a book in the 70s, I think it was, or 80s, and there was a term that he had coined there called social sculpture. And he defined social sculpture as the way in which we shape and mold the world around us. And he was advocating for the fact that everybody should be an artist. Everybody is an artist if we're gonna shape the world. And so I was really attracted to that idea on a conceptual level. And so, I just got into it and started thinking about, how do you do that? Because what was relevant about it for me was that it opened up the possibilities of doing something that had a practical application to it, and that you can actually sculpt a community or some aspect of the world, but you can also do it just by the language of using sculpture. It has an implication that it's poetic, and there's something symbolic and that's about the work.
So tell us the story of how you got to this commitment that you were going to do this socially engaged, community-based art. Tell us that story. How did that happen?
Well, my formal training was in sculpture, painting, but I moved into some aspect of sculpture. And the reason that I was interested in art from the very beginning was because of the social implications of it. That art actually it impacts our world in different ways. And so I, studied painting and tried to push it as far as I could, but with an eye on trying to figure out how to have it connect with things that were really valuable to me. And those were things of, people of color, low-income folks, addressing issues that people who are disadvantaged deal with all the time. So that was my real interest in it. And so I pursued a career doing that kind of work, making paintings and sculptures and trying to figure out how to have them inside the art world, but also outside where there were people that weren't connected to it. And so early on I would do installations for groups like Amnesty International for their Human Rights Week and things like that. So I would do that kind of stuff, and later I end up connecting it with more specific community-based things in a neighborhood in Houston called the Third Ward. Specifically in the early 90s, around 1990. I was doing work with a group of activists that were dealing with police brutality. And so I did a bunch of projects around that. And strangely enough, after doing this, what I thought was a very successful installation that was dealing with police brutality, and it corralled like so much energy around it. It was actually on a handball court, you know. I made this thing, and we had a press conference there, and all the media was on it. It was the cover of all the local papers, and all the television media was there. And I thought it was successful. But I had a high school student who came and gave me probably one of the best critiques I've ever had in my life. You know, he came to my studio with a class, and while he was complimenting me on this work, he turned back and he said, "Well, Mr. Lowe, while your paintings and sculptures show what happens in our community, we don't need that. We know what's happening. We see it every day. We live with it. Like, if you're an artist, why can't you create a solution?" And that was the thing that kind of turned me around, you know, turned it upside down, and I started thinking, how do I do something that actually have a practical, I mean, a more direct practical application? And that's how I connected with the Joseph Beuys social sculpture, and that's why it had so much value to me at that time.
So what happened next? What did you start to do? How did it evolve?
Well, first of all, you know, I mean, it took me a little while, you know, to kind of, you know, unravel. I closed down my studio and I started reading, and that's when I found the Joseph Beuys thing, and I started thinking, so how does this apply? How does this apply in real life? And so I decided that first of all, I just needed to be within a community and listen and see if something comes up. And so I was volunteering with a neighborhood organization, and one day they organized a tour of dangerous places in the surrounding area of their community center. They had city and county officials on a bus driving around looking at dangerous places in the community that they wanted to have torn down. So, you know, I got myself on that tour with them, and we went all over, and on the way back to the center, they stopped at this corner and they pointed and they said, "Now this is the worst place in the entire neighborhood," because it was basically about a 4-block area that only three buildings were occupied. And so, you know, it was like these 22 little shotgun houses that were there, and, you know, a few other houses and stuff, and then a lot of vacant land that was just overgrown. So I agreed, like, yeah, you should tear that down. But then later I was driving through, and they reminded me of something that I had seen before. And there's an artist in Houston, his name was John Biggers. And this is an artist who did a lot of paintings about stereotypes of African American history and culture. And one of the things he focused on was the shotgun house. And so I started talking to him about it. And I asked him, you know, so why do you make these paintings about shotgun houses? Because I'm from the South, I'm from Alabama, and I know shotgun houses, but there's nothing poetic and beautiful about them as far as I knew. But he educated me, and he talked about the origin of the shotgun house, you know, coming from West Africa into the West Indies, and, you know, along the slave trade. And he talked about the important role that they played for building community and allowing people to kind of move through into other aspects of other aspirations they have for life. And I thought that was really kind of interesting. So then I was able to merge the poetic mythology around the shotgun house with Joseph Beuys' concept of social sculpture. And so I went out to pursue those 22 little shotgun houses and question, you know, how can we transform these little houses to show their value in a way that's symbolic and poetic, but also build in some kind of practical program to it. And that was the beginning of Project Row Houses.
So Project Row Houses' mission is to be the catalyst for transforming community through the celebration of art and African American history and culture. So tell us some of the ways that mission's been realized. What are the things that are going on at Project Row Houses?
Yeah, so when we first started and got those 22 houses, the idea was to, you know, how do we turn this decrepit little area of shotgun houses into something that is symbolic in the way that John Biggers' paintings were. But that's not just representational, but it's actually, embodying it in a real sense. And so we went forth to kind of thinking about, what does that mean? Well, I would talk to John Biggers, and it took me a little while to tease these things out, but the value of the shotgun community, he had kind of broken it into 5 different parts that made those communities work. And it was having good and relevant architecture, having art, creativity, and culture at the center of it, education, social safety net, and economic sustainability. So those were the things that he wrapped into his paintings. So then the journey for Project Row Houses was to figure out how to unfold those things within the context of these actual buildings. So of course the architecture was just to clean up the existing houses, to honor them in their kind of natural beauty, in a sense. And then we developed this arts program that have artists to come from near and far. I mean, we work with neighborhood artists, but we also work with artists from all over the world that come into the neighborhood and create works there. This education, the education part of it is, it exists through, it started with youth programming, but now it's more family-based programming that we provide, making sure that every household within our community, the scope of the communities that we're working with, have an educational plan and objective. And then there's a social safety net part that we started out with a transitional housing program for single mothers. And but that eventually grew into low-income rental housing and so on and so forth. So we do a lot of that kind of work. And then the economic sustainability, which we're, it's a uphill battle, but we're determined to do it. And right now we're incubating, small businesses and trying to give people those opportunities. And also we're pretty much so in the real estate business as well. So that's a part of the economic engine of our work, is real estate.
So you just, you got to, social service, education programs, business incubation, sustainability. Why is art important to this? Why isn't it just, this I know is a crucial part of it for you, is that it's the creative practice, it's artistic, it's culture. Why is that so critical?
Yeah.
Or maybe a way of putting this is say, what is it that artists can bring to this kind of project that's so important?
Yeah, and that distinguish it from other things. Yeah, I always have to question that. Whenever we engage in some aspect of the community that we're interested in working in, we have to kind of think about it in terms of okay, well, there's a practical need for this. That's okay, but what does it mean from an art side? I mean, how do we make it? Is it possible to make it speak symbolically? Can it be poetic? How do you kind of, is it possible to add layers to it that make it more meaningful than its end purpose of use? And that's where it all comes in. So oftentimes people ask me, well, you're doing housing, so what does that have to do with art? People do housing all the time. Well, in general, the purpose that most people do housing, real estate folks do housing, well, maybe they do it to get, people in them, to get people living in them, but they really do it mostly for a financial, as a financial thing, reason why they do it. And so maybe the financial thing is the first thing, and then to get people in them is the second thing. That's fair enough. But as an artist doing it, those those are important and they're intentional, but really the most important thing is what does doing housing do in a symbolic way that add to the conversation of what housing mean for what does it mean for a community, and how does this particular housing project add to that conversation? How is it layered in different ways? So with our housing that we do, I mean, the layering that we add to the housing that we do is there's architecture. The architecture is as in John Biggers talked about the shotgun houses, is extremely important. So we really work hard with the architecture, figuring out, how does it connect with the old and opens up possibilities for the new and that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, then it's so, okay, and the people that are living there, How do they connect with community? And what does it mean for them to live in these houses? What does their experience living in these houses do to distinguish them from other places? You know? And how do they talk about that? You know, how did that become a part of a narrative that is beyond just the fact that somebody's got housing and that somebody made some money? You know, so it's really about, you know, creating the opportunity for people to be reflective and to be you know, thoughtful about the things that are around them.
Can you give me like a single case example where you've seen this, like a person or a group who've come through, where you've seen the kind of impact of the creative, the symbolic, the poetic on them?
Well, I mean, from sticking with the housing part, I mean, so, you know, when we started out to build the first houses in our community that had been built for quite a long time because people were not investing in the neighborhood, we thought really hard about how to design housing that connects to the architecture of the shotgun house.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do we do that in a way of representing the possibility of building a community that was not just wiping away the past, but
mm-hmm.
you know, bringing in, paying attention to the past as it bring in the future, and through that simple effort, all of a sudden, you know, we you know, basically ignited a sense of history and purpose within our community, within the political leadership, within the people that live there. I mean, whenever people talk about what they want for our community as it grow, they look to the type of work that we've been doing in terms of housing to talk about that. Now, granted, the market that's coming from the outside,
mm-hmm.
they have no relationship to that.
Right.
You know, they're not interested in the poetics of it. But from our standpoint, from a community-based art project, that's the core of what we're all about.
So you've spoken very eloquently just now about the kind of symbolic and poetic impacts within the community itself. But you also just mentioned, you know, the people that come from outside. Mm-hmm. Your work is so centrally located in these questions of the specific community that you're working in. It's the African American community in the 3rd Ward of Houston. But as an artist, and because you bring artists from all over the world to put work into some of the houses, this is this is obviously a project that has attracted a lot of attention throughout the United States, throughout the world. So people come to see this art, to see this community from the outside who aren't members of the community. Maybe they're not African American, maybe they're not from Texas, from Houston. How does the kind of symbolic argument that you've just been making, how does that work for people outside of the community? Have you found the impact of that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think people that are interested in art, I mean, it's an easy, you know, it's easy for them. I mean, that's what they, you know, they show up and they want to read it as, mm-hmm. you know, an artwork, and they look for the symbolic nature of it, whatever. Then there's a side of the, you know, the practical side where it's a little bit more challenging and difficult to get people to understand it. However, I do find that most, you know, I mean, you know, African Americans, because it's so integral to the African American experience, these little shotgun houses, mm-hmm. and the challenges that African American communities are having around the country, mm-hmm. you know, in terms of gentrification. I mean, they all understand it. You know, they all gravitate to that symbolic thing. You know, that having those little houses sit there and having these, you know, new houses that we're building that are reflective of that history becomes hugely important and symbolically valuable.
That's a really interesting point, and it brings me to the question of gentrification, which you just mentioned. Now, all throughout this country, there are these cities. Houston is one of them. Portland, Oregon is one. 58% of the districts that were primarily African American, lower income, have gentrified in the past 11 years, 10, 11 mm-hmm. years. You've begun to make an argument about the value of social sculpture or social practice art in responding to and perhaps slowing or mitigating gentrification. Mm-hmm. Is that the case? Do you believe that this kind of work has that function?
I don't know that it will have the that it can play the role of slowing gentrification so much, because I mean, gentrification is generally, I mean, that's a purely, it's driven by pure economic, benefit and gain, right? So that's so what I've started to do, and the approach that I use is to not so much worry about the gentrification part, because that's the market-driven part. So I try to figure out, how do we deal with the other side, though? The people that are interested in the more, in the things that we learn from the poetic and symbolic things of the work that we do. There are people who are interested in, there are real estate investors who are interested in neighborhoods that have meaning and value. So those are the people that start to that I'm interested in. And so it's not about slowing gentrification, it's about creating balance.
I see.
So as the market pushes its focus on economic and financial gain, then we really work with the people that we know that we can get to understand this other value that is reflected in the work symbolically, and try to bring those people in so that we can create somewhat of a balance. And I think actually ultimately that's kind of the way that I think the neighborhood of the future has to be. I mean, you don't want the market to stay out because they bring a valuable resources in. But at the same time, though, we have to figure out how to elevate the other values, and we can't necessarily expect the market forces to do that.
It takes something like a genius grant to somebody like you who has done this kind of project to give it a kind of public recognition beyond the immediate community. And really makes an argument for the kind of intrinsic value of these non-economic qualities.
Yeah, the art historian, critic, I don't know how she talks about herself, but Lucy Lappard, she wrote an essay about land art, and I was really fascinated with the way that she described land art, and I'm going to butcher this quote, but it was something like, the purpose of land art is to focus the untrained eye on the vastness of the landscape, because we're not able to see it, right? So you get. But she also said that she thinks later in the article she thinks that land art is for city folks, because people that live on the land, they get to see that stuff because they live with it. Their eyes are no longer untrained, and so. When I think about that, about the fact that it's hard for people who are not trained to see huge landscapes. So when artists do something symbolic, to just hold your sight there for just a little bit, to think about it differently, you can start to see the rest of it. And that's similarly what I think the, art in the social context does. Art and social and community engaged art, is that something like Project Row Houses, people are seeing neighborhoods, transform, and there are all kind of things that happen, and there's so many complicated things around it. But when we, kind of slice out this little thing, and it's not massive in terms of the needs of the neighborhood. I mean, it's just, but its scale comes in the symbolic power that it gives people to think about the broadness of what's happening in the neighborhood. And I think that's where the value.
And there's some good evidence that this value is spreading. That is, similar kinds of projects are being carried out in New Orleans and other places. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's been really, really interesting for me. And 20 plus years ago, I would have never thought that something that I've started working on would have such a strong impact. But there's the work that I've been able to do in different places around the country and around the world that's been interesting. But actually, what's most important is some of the other people that it's influenced. I mean, people like Mark Bradford, who's in LA, who's doing incredible work, that we've bonded over this work, and I've been able to kind of mentor him along. Theaster Gates, who's in Chicago, another person that I've been able to kind of mentor along, and being in conversation with them and others, and trying to figure out, how this actually moves, and we get closer to the point of where Joseph Beuys talk about everybody being an artist, because there's a kind of there's a kind of freeing of creativity in this kind of work, because no single artist do this work. You have to figure out how to work with it collaboratively and with people from all walks of life. And what it does is it brings those folks who are not accustomed to seeing themselves as artists and as creative, and put them in situations where they can work in ways that almost go against the grain of what they may have been trained to do professionally, because it does reach for the symbolic as its initial importance, and the practical side that most people are trained to kind of to use the skills to do, that becomes framed around this whole thing of the symbolic.
We've got just a minute or two left. This is probably the last question. If you were asked, I'm going to ask you, what lesson do you wish that have you learned over these 20 plus years that you wish you knew at the beginning? If you could do it all over again, what have you learned that you would do from the start?
I think the thing I've learned this over time. I just kind of hinted to it in my last answer, was that you can't do it alone, which means you have to trust people, and trust is a very difficult thing. In particular, if you come from an art training where artists are the creators, and they control the destiny of the creation. But all of a sudden, you're in a situation where, no, you can't really do it on your own. You have to figure out how to trust someone else. And so even though my process from the very beginning was one of working with people from all walks of life, and that was probably more out of necessity than wisdom, because the truth of the matter was that I had to work with people because I didn't have the skill sets to do all the things that it took to get something like Project Row Houses off the ground. But I also see, looking with hindsight, there were opportunities for honoring people who had much better knowledge and skill sets around things that I didn't trust them in the process well enough to allow that to happen. And so going forward, it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing thing for me to be able to gain enough trust in potential partners and collaborators, and also part of that is being able to get supporters to understand the process and believe in the process of collaboration, that you can also instill a sense of trust in them to allow these kind of messy and sometimes unlikely collaborations to come together.
Well, that's a great point on which to end. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your experiences with us. Thank you so much for the amazing work you do. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Rick Lowe, a Houston-based artist and community organizer. In 2014, Lowe was awarded a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Lowe gave a talk, Art and the Social Context, at the U of O on May 2nd, 2016. The talk was sponsored by Design, Create, Change, the proposed new interdisciplinary major in the School of Architecture and Allied Arts. Thanks for watching.